Okay, so we ended up talking about
The
how I
40 Thieves.
40 Thieves, yeah, because we were talking about the sexual hygiene books
Right,
and the road shows they did, and that
right.
was and the obscenity laws, yes, that we were talking.
Right. So you obviously know something about this group of people called the 40 Thieves. They were very early in American so-called exploitation movies,
Yes,
which wasn't just sexploitation, but sexual subject matter was part of it. These guys were around. They really started in the silent period, but say the 30s, 40s really was their prime time. But yeah, they one of the popular genres of exploitation movie from that early period was the birth of a baby movie, right? So nobody nobody saw a baby being born in a movie like the because Hollywood.
that was if I can interject, I think that was the Mom and Dad movie. Was the title?
There's one of them, but there were several.
Well, several. I thought it was that one. That one.
There were several films, and also there were films that dealt with venereal disease as well. How do you get a venereal disease?
VDs, yes.
BD, right. So these were things that were discussed by doctors, and maybe there was some literature from medical professionals about these things. And probably there were even some kind of educational films shown to doctors about how you deliver a baby if there are certain problems, whatever. But the general public didn't see these kind of films. So some of the filmmakers in the 40 Thieves had the idea to make a movie about a young woman getting pregnant, and then she goes to have the baby at a hospital, and then you literally see the baby. You see footage of the baby
Being born, yeah.
emerging
Being
from
delivered, yeah.
emerging from her vagina, whatever, and being born. So, uh, and these films could be and frequently were shut down by local authorities, the police, by local ministers or priests, by the local government. There were people who complained that these were not, no one should watch these films. But what they tended to argue was no, 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 that this is an important issue that affects the lives of everybody who has children. And there's nothing obscene about a child being born, is what
Yeah,
they argue,
exactly.
right? This is a natural, normal thing. And we're also educating people about how it should happen properly, what proper medical care is, that kind of stuff. So the 40 Thieves were filmmakers trying to make some money. They really weren't too concerned about healthy babies. So
No, no, they were not. Yeah.
they were not really telling the truth, but the general argument was that yeah, this kind of stuff is not really obscene according to the law, right? So when porno came along, hardcore porn in the 70s, the people who were financing those movies, the people who were showing those movies in theaters, and these were generally the people who got arrested,
Yeah.
uh, they would basically make the same kind of arguments that, oh, our film deals with subject matter that's important to Americans. So, for instance, before Deep Throat, and I know you know about Deep Throat, and I'm sure many of the listeners know about Deep Throat. That was the first important American movie with hardcore sex in it. Now, it's not the first one. It's
It
not
was
the
not the
first,
first one, yeah.
but it was the first important one. Before Deep Throat, for a couple of years before Deep Throat came out, there were dozens of movies that pretended to be documentaries about having a happy, healthy sex life. Okay? They claimed to be educational films about how people have sex, and they were supposedly helping people by teaching them how to have a happy, healthy sex life. They were sometimes called white coater films,
Hmm.
meaning that there was a person in the film wearing a doctor's coat, a white doctor's coat, and they would talk about, okay, I'll put on my white coat now. Now we're about to see a scene where a man and a woman have oral sex. This is the proper way to have oral sex, and many
Yeah.
couples like to have oral sex because it makes your sex life more interesting. And then they would cut to a scene of a couple of porn actors, doing a blowjob scene.
Yeah.
So what they would argue is, oh, no, 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 this is not a dirty, obscene movie. This movie is meant to help people to learn to have happier,
Educational material, yeah.
educational material. And something similar happened in Germany, right? With these Schulmädchen films,
Yes,
where
full
they
of it.
supposedly are educational, right? So, and if anybody wants to go back and watch Deep Throat, by the way, which, as I said before, is the first well-known, important, very financially successful porn film. If you go watch it, you'll realize that it's pretending to be a white coder.
Yes, because there's a role of the doctor there. Yeah,
Exactly. It's about a woman who mysteriously has a clitoris in her
in
throat.
the throat. Yeah,
So she's not having sexual pleasure and she doesn't know why. And she goes to a quote doctor, and the doctor finds out she has only have an orgasm when she has oral sex, right?
yeah.
So it's a parody. It's a joke. Gerard Damiano, who made the film, knew it was a joke. It's a comedy, really. The film is a comedy. And it's a parody about these white coder films, right? So it's both on a certain level imitating the white coder and using the protection of the redeeming social value. But also, one last thing I'll mention, and this precedes the United States, but comedy, humor, a parody of something is also frequently considered to be a more protected form of speech. If I'm doing a parody of something, it's not the same. If I say, "Oh, fuck you," and I do it in a way that's supposed to be funny, it's actually considered to be different from me saying, "Oh yeah, fuck you," right?
Yes, exactly.
Right.
Yeah,
Because
yeah.
I'm supposedly making a joke out of saying "fuck you." I'm not actually saying "fuck you." So
Yeah,
the
that's it.
Deep Throat is both a comedy, it's a parody of white coders, and it's a kind of a fake white coder.
Yeah,
So even that film is doing things to help protect it from being prosecuted for obscenity in the United States. And by the way, when it was prosecuted, many people said, "Oh, come on, it's a comedy. You know, it's a joke, right?" Also, don't forget, by the early 70s, America had already gone through the so-called sexual revolution, which is really not an intellectual thing. It's just a byproduct of the fact that we had this famous baby boom,
yep.
right? Where so many children were born after the Second World War that by the mid to late 1960s, the country was flooded with teenagers. And so what do these teenagers do? They're running around fucking.
Yeah.
There are young people running around fucking everywhere in the United States in the late 1960s. So it becomes a very visible phenomenon, which is hard to hide, right? So that's why it becomes kind of normalized in a lot of ways. And by the early 70s, even older people said, "Oh, come on, everybody's talking about sex and sex is around us everywhere, so we're not going to hide it anymore." But the truth is, they sort of couldn't hide it.
Yeah.
It just became too much a part of daily life to hide. So people kind of gave up and
But
just
it's
said,
still,
"Okay,
but it was
they'll
also,
allow sex films now."
but it was also a byproduct, shall we can say, of the pre-love generation at the end of 60s, because obviously we're talking Deep Throat since 1972.
Right, right,
Yeah,
but what I'm trying to argue here, and some people could disagree with me, is that the sexual revolution and free love was not some intellectual movement. It was a sheer product of the force of social pressures.
yeah,
The baby boom created such a huge group of people who were running around having
yeah.
sex so visibly everywhere that it just became a normal part of everyday life. It didn't take intellectuals to say, "You know what? We should make sex part of normal public life." That's not what happened. What happened is young people were fucking everywhere, fucking in
So
the
it was
street.
like a normalized
You
society.
couldn't avoid it. You could
Yeah,
not avoid it. So it just became normalized
yeah,
as a result of social pressures. And that's really what drove the legalization, or maybe I should say the legitimation of pornography. Because pornography has never actually technically been legalized in the United States.
hmm
It's never really been legalized in the United States. Pornography just was legitimated to a relative degree or tolerated in the United States. And Deep Throat helped to drive that in a lot of ways because it became so well known and it was so difficult to prosecute the film, that people sort of gave up. Having said that, in the mid 1970s, the federal government did prosecute the movie relatively successfully. But the reason they did so was primarily because the people who actually financed that film and who owned that film were involved with what we call organized crime, the mafia.
Yeah, they were the mob family, yeah.
It was a mob family. So the government, the FBI in the United States had been playing this game with the mafia for a couple of generations. And this was just another way to get at the mafia.
Yeah.
And it was only really a small faction within the mafia that got involved with pornography. But the federal government only got interested because it was the mafia, not because it was pornography. Yeah. So they started to bust Deep Throat because prints of the movie were being shipped from one state to another state, and it was against the law in the United States.
That's a federal crime then.
You're shipping material across state lines, so that means it's now a federal crime, not something within the state. And then they made the argument that the film was obscene, so they're shipping pornographic material interstate, etc. But really what they were concerned with was the amount of money that it was making for the mafia. And what typically happens in the United States is the mafia kills people, they do all sorts of illegal things, but the easiest way to send people in the mafia to jail is to show that they made a lot of money and did not pay taxes on their illegal earnings.
Al Capone would say the same thing about that.
The famous American gangster Al Capone, the bootlegger, went to jail for tax evasion. Yeah. So the federal government really only got involved when it was about the mafia and when they figured this is another way for them to attack organized crime. But the majority of American porn was not produced by anybody involved with the Italian mafia at all. Most of it was not. And as everybody knows, hardcore porno movies began to proliferate in the wake of Deep Throat, say by 1973, 74, 75. All those movie theaters that used to show sexploitation have now changed over to showing hardcore porn. And the audience completely demands hardcore porn. If they were to try to show, if one of those theaters tried to show a softcore movie from 1968, even if it had very hot simulated sex, they would ask for their money back.
Yeah, they were out of fashion very quickly. Yes.
Out of fashion. People wanted to see porno. I'll say one other thing too, because you made a comment earlier about the 70s porno movies having these storylines, right?
Mm-hmm.
Having a plot and a story. That was typically true. Again, this was another way to defend the film. Oh, look, somebody wrote a script. That means it's a work of art, right?
Yep.
But at the same time that people were seeing hardcore porno at regular movie theaters, let's say the porno was wrapped into a story, right? There would be certain sex scenes in a larger film that wasn't completely sex. At the same time, you could go to so-called adult bookstores in most major cities and go into the back of the bookstore, and there would be these booths.
Peep shows, yeah.
With a curtain, and you could put some money in the machine, and then what you would see is nothing, but maybe you put in a quarter, 25 cents, and you got 1 or 2 minutes of movie, and then you'd have to put in another quarter. What you saw then was nothing but complete hardcore porno.
Yeah.
No story. And that was very popular. And you could do that any time of day. And it was also cheap because it was expensive to go to a porno theater. Maybe at that time it cost $5 to get into a porno theater when it might cost you $2 or $3 to go to a regular movie theater. So it wasn't cheap. This notion that drunks and drug addicts hung out at porn theaters, that is not true. It was businessmen with a suit and a tie because it was very expensive. But you could go to a peep show, and if you had 50 cents, you could maybe, or if you had $1 worth of change, you could probably watch enough of a movie to masturbate while you were sitting in that booth, which is what people did. That's what people did. That's why they went to those booths. So this is another way that pornography circulated in America at that time. And you could also buy the little reels of 8mm, super 8mm movies, which were called loops frequently. Because when they played them in the booths, they would play in a continuous loop. They'd have a 3-minute movie, but the movie would play over. Every 3 minutes, it would start again. That's why they called it a loop. But if you owned a projector, like for home movies about your vacation or your kid graduating from high school, you could buy a reel of film and take it home, and now you could masturbate at home. So this was another, because it was a little more complicated to masturbate in a big movie theater with a bunch of other people sitting there, although eventually that also became normal.
Yeah.
And even in regular movie theater, porno theaters that were showing what we call straight pornography, not for gay people, but for heterosexual people, even in those theaters, some gay men started to go and circulate in those theaters, and they would offer sexual services to other men who were sitting there because the men were frustrated and wanted a blowjob or wanted a hand job or something like that. This has been pretty well documented as well. So there was a certain amount of sex happening in those regular theaters, but most of it happened, I would say, in the peep booths or for people who bought the little 3-minute films and took them home.
Yeah.
So that was another way you could consume films, and those films were also prosecuted. And they had a more difficult time because they couldn't really claim any redeeming social value. They were clearly just pornography for the purposes of creating sexual titillation, as we called it, right? And that's not protected speech.
Yes.
And those places were also prosecuted, and in many cases, they had problems. And by the way, the organized crime, the mafia, got very involved with that part of the business because the only way to protect that part of the business was to pay off, bribe judges and to bribe other officials. And the mafia was pretty good at that. It's called influence peddling, right? Yeah. The mafia knew politicians, they knew judges, they would pay them, and so they could fix it up so that you didn't have, or they pay the police. So
you paid protection money, and you were good to go. Yes.
Right. So because a commercial 35 millimeter feature film that you would show in a regular movie theater, that was very expensive to make that. Very expensive. Then, so they would try to protect it using legal protection that would cover the whole country. That was important as well, because you wanted to be able to send that film around the country. But for these little rolls of film that maybe cost $50 to produce, and then maybe it cost you, who knows, $3 to reproduce each one of them in a lab. You could make 100 copies for $3 a piece, maybe, right? Yeah. And then sell them for $20 at an adult bookstore, right?
I read that some people were very rich selling them. Yeah, those looks.
Oh yes, people made very good money. I mean, we're not talking about Ford Motor Company, IBM,
but Shell
Oil money, right? But somebody who was what we call a small businessman, somebody who was in that business by himself, maybe had a couple people working for him, and they're producing these films, paying the lab, they're shipping them around the country. Sure, you could buy a very nice house and a very nice car with the income from that kind of a business. Absolutely.
That's a lot of money. Even like 10,000 bucks in 70s. That was a lot of money.
Very good money. 10,000 bucks in the 70s was probably an average income for an average working person in this country. You know, a regular house at that time probably cost you $10,000 or $15,000.
So we're talking about it. Yeah.
If you were making $100,000 a year in pornography in the 1970s, you were living an upper middle class lifestyle. Yeah. But it was a much more high stakes game when you were making 35 millimeter feature films. You know, this is like Hollywood movie stuff.
Yeah.
And distributing that in movie theaters. So I have a lot of respect for the people who got into the game on that level. It took a lot of money to get in. There was a lot at risk, and then you're advertising in newspapers. Those movies were distributed like regular movies. If you go look at the New York Times, maybe the most famous newspaper in the United States, if you go look at the New York Times in 1973, 1974, and look at the section where there are advertisements for movies, you'll see ads for all the Hollywood movies, Walt Disney movies, European art movies, and porno, all on the same page.
Yes.
And by the way, the New York Times was happy to run those ads, and they charged the same amount of money that they charged somebody advertising a James Bond movie or Star Wars or a Steven Spielberg movie. Those pornographers paid the same amount of money. So I have a lot of respect for those guys from a business point of view. They were playing a very high stakes game, and they played it just like regular movie studios did, and they were proud of themselves for doing that. Now, the movies were not always great movies, but let's admit it, a lot of movies from Hollywood are terrible as
They are
well.
not. They are on the same level, probably. Yes.
Right, absolutely.
Now,
And then because because hardcore took over, people like Joe Sarno were then compelled to change to hardcore. People from the 60s had to begin to make hardcore movies if they wanted to continue making movies, because there was no market for the older softcore sexploitation anymore. So the filmmakers had to change gears as well too.
good that you mentioned that, because my next question was about right about that. The thing is that although when I read or listened to Dave Friedman, obviously Joe Sarno, Doris Wishman, those sexploitation filmmaker, they always stressed that they didn't want to go to make hardcore movies, but they did eventually.
Yeah.
Like all three of them mentioned, they actually did, although not really willingly, probably. It's just for a
Yes.
so
I knew David Friedman, was lucky enough to know him, uh, had a few meetings with him in person, talked to him on the phone. I didn't know him as well as others, but he was a lovely guy, so I did know him. But I know from my conversations, both with Doris and with Joe, that they were both very reluctant to begin to make hardcore. And there were two reasons for that. First of all, because hardcore was very questionable from a legal point of view, and they were afraid of being prosecuted. They didn't
yes,
want to go to jail.
which is understandable.
Understandable. The other reason is because, and Joe was much more articulate about this, when you're a filmmaker, when you're a real filmmaker, you're trying to make a movie and you want the movie to have an impact on people, that you want your artistic
Vision.
effort to have an impact on people. But anybody with a camera, let's say a video camera, anybody who can manage to film two people fucking is going to be able to show that to somebody, because people are naturally interested in seeing that kind of image.
Yes.
There's just it's a neurological impulse. Whoa, look at that, right? It's like watching a car accident, seeing somebody's brains get blown out, right?
Yes, exactly.
People seem to go, wow, what is that? And they look, right? So Joe felt that when the porno appeared on the screen, the filmmaking stopped. Nobody was really watching a movie as an artwork anymore. They were just sitting there going, whoa, what is that? Right? They were having a very primal
reaction
that made them sort of forget they were watching a movie.
Yeah.
Now, some people would argue that filmmakers ideally want you to forget you're watching a movie, and they want you to feel like you're living in the situations in the screen, and there's some truth to that.
Yeah.
But at the same time, and I've spoken with many filmmakers, not always about this subject, but trying to understand their attitudes about it. At the same time, they obviously also want to be known as the person who created this experience. It's very rare to find a filmmaker who says, I don't care if anybody who knows I made this, as long as they're having a good time. No.
No,
they don't feel that way. The same thing with like a rock and roll band. Oh, they want you to know who they are.
Of course,
yeah,
it's a fame factor, yeah.
Sure, they want you to they want to make a song that makes you feel like jumping up and down and having fun. But oh boy, they really want you to know that they're the people who played that song. Right? So it was very important to Joe that you knew that you were watching a Joe Sarno movie, and that you were watching a movie that was made by somebody who cared and tried to make a movie. Joe realized that Joe put effort into, he put thought into the camera work, into the lighting, into the sound. But he knew that as soon as it was a pure sex scene, pardon my French, it didn't fucking matter anymore. All you had, we say, pardon my French, some people do it.
Yeah, I know.
When they swear. It's not really French, but I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know where that comes from, but I don't want to use foul language for your listeners in case they don't want to hear it. But in that case, I felt like punctuating the statement.
Yeah.
Nobody fucking cared. I sound like I'm in the mafia. Hey, nobody fucking cares, right?
Yeah.
Nobody fucking cared. And when the sex was on, you could have terrible lighting, the worst camera angle. It didn't matter. So Joe knew that was sort of the death of creative filmmaking in the sex genres, because at a certain point the filmmaking would become unimportant. Anybody who could get a movie camera, pointed at people having sex, and got some kind of footage would be able to sell.
Would be a filmmaker, yeah.
Right. And when video came along, that proved to be true.
Yeah. And to this day, it's true.
And to this day, it's even more so, because everyone has a phone in their, everyone has a movie camera in their phone.
Yeah, exactly.
So I could pull the phone out of my back pocket and I could make a sex film right now. I would be the only person in it, but I could do it right now. And no one would care about the lighting or the camera work or anything.